All right, everybody. So we're going to get into the chapter on work, and we're going to kind of discuss that a little bit, and then I'll stop before we get into the articles, and we will do that on a separate one. So we're going to talk about unpaid and paid labor and kind of where that puts us when we talk about gender. So unpaid labor, we talk about work. We talk about when somebody asks you, what work do? You usually respond with a job, right? You usually respond with what makes you some kind of economic means. But what we don't really talk about, like we do in the academic circles, but what doesn't get brought up in mainstream conversation a lot is the manual work that is required of us to just upkeep life, right? So paying your bills, cleaning your house, doing your dishes, figuring out what you're going to eat, and obtaining food, whether that be going to get the carryout or whether that be making the meals yourself and grocery shopping, doing your laundry, all of these things that are part of they're automatically built into the labor system, right? There's something that you're not economically getting paid for, but they're also labor that has to get done in order to maintain workers, right? You can't choose not to go to the grocery store or not pick up food and not eat for an extended period of time and still be part of the labor force, right? Because you'll starve. So it's work, it's labor, it's things that you're putting into your life, but it's not necessarily labor that we talk about as work in the same ways. And that's generally because there's not an economic means. Now, if somebody does this for a living, say they have a house cleaning business or a carpet cleaning business or something like that, then that can be considered work, even though it's the same task. And that really falls down to, we qualify work as this thing that's going to acquire us an economic gain. However, 2/3 of the domestic labor that is done in a household is done by women. And in comparison, usually in a typical week, you're going to see about 14 hours of household labor done by women compared to, say, 5 hours of household labor done by men. And that's not including the child rearing things. So that's not including your bedtimes. That's not including your picking up the kids. Well, picking up the kids probably is included because that would be an errand, but that's not included the time it takes to get rid of the emotional meltdown your kid's having, right? Like that's not including the time you're taking them to the park or playing outside with them or just engaging with them to do their homework, those kinds of things, right? This is non-child rearing activities. So this is your laundry, your dishes, your cooking, your cleaning, these things. And when we talk about that, that's a huge difference in allotted amount of time that someone does in a work. And as we move to a more dual earner situation, or we move to an economy that doesn't really work for a single income household, the labor distribution from say a stay-at-home parent to the labor distribution of two working parents didn't shift in the same ways. That labor differential maintained. And it maintained across very gendered lines. So when we talk about the tasks that typically are done by women, you're going to see the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the child rearing. Whereas you're going to see the men do more of the fixing things. You're going to see them do more of the yard work things. You're going to see them do things that maybe require more manual labor. But what we're seeing in those normatives is this gendered assumption of who's responsible for what, and that not changing based on the other jobs that one might carry, including a work out of the household paid employment. And those things cause strife. They cause well-being crisis. They cause overwork. They cause burnout. They cause a significant amount of concern for women who are holding both an economic position at some company or within some workplace environment, and then coming home and taking the brunt of the unpaid labor responsibilities as well. What you do see once you get to a specific class is you see this hiring of help, this idea that once you maintain a certain level of economic wealth, that specific kind of labor you can opt out of. You can require someone else's expenses to do that, and or experience to do that. And usually that experience or those people that you hire to do that have a very distinct class, race, gender marking and status. So you're going to generally see lower income women of color fulfilling those jobs of the hired help. And this is something that's consistent, right? It's consistent and has been essentially formulated out of our historic roots of maintaining households during slave era, during the era of conquest, during the era of heavy immigration. And you're going to see that those who that has a lingering impact on that particular kind of work, and the power differentials between those who hire those individuals and the individuals who actually take these jobs themselves. There's a gender gap in the domestic labor that is not kept pace with the social change. So in social change, we're talking about gender equality. We're talking about the issues that arise. And there's really a push for, okay, we believe that the genders can be equal. And overarchingly, that has been a sentiment that's been growing in support for a long time and pretty consistently. It's not necessarily where we want it to be, but it is trending upwards. On the flip side, the gendered attitudes of what housework should be done or what roles someone should take within the household, that's not shifting in the same ways. And so what you're seeing is, yes, you can be equal and go make economic money, and we want you to go have this income, we want you to go work, but we also want to keep the household structure the same. And that has lingering power differentials, and that has lingering consequences socially for women who have to take on both of those roles. Now, I will say that historically, women of color have been having this conversation for an extended period of time, because for the majority of the women of color in this country, there was never a point in which you were the one hiring help, or you were the one that was a single income family, or a single income family that wasn't you. And so traditionally, or historically, more accurately, historically, women of color have always had to work because of the economic racist policies and positions that have put them in with less opportunities for promotions, with less opportunities for jobs that would allow them, the social class, to not have to work. And so for women of color, this differential of power, this having an income, but also having a lot of unpaid labor to do, is something that they have consistently been talking about since before Ida B. Wells was having conversations about the right to vote. Okay, so this is something that women of color have felt like white feminism has tended to overshadow the conversations that they have been trying to have for a long period of time. So when we get into the conversations about paid labor, we need to understand a couple of things. First of all, most women work outside of the house. And that includes women that are parents, that includes women that are that have very young children. Most women work outside of the house, or have jobs like mine where you're working, but you are still at home too, because you have an online situation. But there's a history of how women have been able to work and what have you. Now, I'm going to talk about this, but I also want you to keep in mind that historically, women of color have always been part of the economic market, right? They have always held jobs. So with that being said, with the industrialization of America in the early turn of the century, came work in factories. This work generally was very, very hard labor. with really crappy work conditions. Women and children were enlisted to do these things, and it usually was lower income families. Prior to that, you're going to see a lot of households operating farms. You're going to see a lot of the women still having roles in that. You're going to see a lot of women doing a lot of child rearing to have lots of children, to help manage farms, to help manage those particular economic needs. Post-industrialization and factory work, you saw, well, around the same time, you saw, especially in the 1920s, probably to the 1940s, 50s, and then again, another boom probably at the end of the 1900s. But you saw a lot of middle-class women becoming college educated and taking roles like teachers, librarians, even some who were working in politics. You saw a really big boom in the 30s of women politicians. Unfortunately, with the Great Depression came work shortages, and with work shortages came a desire for the U.S. economy to structure women as something that stays at home so that the men can have the job, so that they can be the breadwinners of the family, blah, 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 blah. Post the Great Depression, you saw when World War I and World War II came, and there was a large amount of young men, especially, being drafted and being sent overseas. You saw a large industrial need for women in the workplace. And so what ended up happening were women were really rallied. And this is where you saw Rosie the Riveter. This is where you saw some of those calls to help your country. Like, hey, we need women to come work in the factory. We need you to come make these supplies that we're going to send overseas. We need you to be a part of this. And without women doing that, our economics in the US and our rise to economic power within the world stage probably would not have been possible, because there was a really, really large percent of women who were now entering the workforce. The problem here is that once the war was over and the men came back, they didn't want to leave their jobs, right? This was something that provided them with the ability to feel empowered, to feel good about themselves. They were now making economic means. This meant that they didn't have to marry as early. This meant that they didn't have to go necessarily, that they had choices. And the US economic system decided that they needed to do a very big social campaign to really fix this issue, because they were overflooding with employees, and the men that were coming back from war were not getting jobs that essentially they were promised after coming back. And so what they did was essentially create this rebranding of women's roles in society and branded them as this entity that needed to be at home so that the men could take on these jobs that were really well paying, considerably, that could easily support a family. And now it was time for you to rebuild America. It was time for you, note the political lines here, right? It was time for you to go back to cooking, to cleaning, and it started to morph into, you saw a lot of family shows where women were stay-at-home moms. You saw a lot of a different kind of idea of what the women's roles were. And that was intentional, because they needed them out of the jobs that they needed to give to the people who came back from the war. This is not to say that no women fought in the war, because that was not the case. However, that was also very rare. And they had their own sets of concerns once they came back home. That is for a different lecture on a different day. Then came with that 1950s really push women back into a specific kind of social dynamic and social norm that brew all sorts of advocacy, right? Because all of a sudden women realized that once they were in places together and frequently meeting and having conversations, that they were capable of doing the same jobs that now these men were doing. And that they were capable of rallying and creating community and support. And they spearheaded missions within the civil rights movement, within the free love movement, within the women's movement itself. Like, these all came out of an era of, hey, wait a minute, we were making progress and now we're getting this pushback into this thing. And so every political tide has a push and a pull. And the pushback to women's work really came in the 50s, and with a lot of help from an early 60s, with a lot of help from the McCarthy era and just really fundamentalist ideologies taking the political forefront. But through the 60s and the 70s, and with a extreme amount of rebelliousness, women ended up fighting and getting the Equal Pay Act, kind of. That's still, it's still a work in progress. It's something that's been on the docket in Congress hundreds of times. And it is something that, despite the fact that we have Title IX and despite the fact that we have discrimination policies so that technically your sex cannot be something that you're discriminated against, saying that you have to be paid equally somehow just keeps not getting passed by a majority vote that is not female. And again, when we get into the politics section, we will talk more about that. But things they did get was Title VIII, Title VII. You got the Civil Rights Act passed. You got sexual harassment protections passed. You got Title IX. You got the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. You got Americans with Disabilities Act. You got affirmative action. All of these things that allowed space for women workers to have a better chance in the market, to have less of a legal battle, and there was less of a social dynamic to pull back these ideas that women couldn't be in the workplace, right? Or they couldn't hold specific jobs. They could always be teachers. They could always be someone cleaning your house. They could always be someone cleaning at, like, say, a hotel or what have you. And they could always be servers at a restaurant. Post that, there were things that there were markets and jobs they just were not, you were not seeing as many women in. And so this kind of, your book kind of stops talking about the history of women's work past really the 80s, but I do want to mention that while there was a lot of progress, the 80s and 90s were a lot of pushback as well. And through the Reagan era politics and the epicness of social discrimination via public policy, there became an issue for politicians, because while they couldn't say they necessarily wanted women in the workplace or to be in the same area, they could keep touting that they wanted America to look the same way, with that single heteronormative household with the man as the breadwinner and the woman staying home and making babies. This wasn't economically feasible. And from the 80s until now, you see this massive amount, and I've attached more on economics in here if you're interested. But what ended up happening was our economic system stopped being viable for a single family income for most individuals in our country. And in doing that, that requires that women were working too. And that became a very hazy political strategy, because in doing that, you're creating a pushback to the social norm that certain political agencies were requiring of Americans and the gender roles that they're requiring. But on the flip side, we're not necessarily dealing with the economic realities that this country holds. And at this juncture, a single income family is really, really hard to make work. And that's due to the stinking middle class and the massive amount of wealth gap we have in this country. And again, all of that has been posted in another thread in there. I urge you to check out some of those things, because they're going to explain it better than I can, because I'm not an economist, nor do I want to be. When we get into the dual labor market, we're going to talk about essentially the primary market, or these markets that essentially I was talking about where men were the forefront. So your doctors, your lawyers, your upper and middle class jobs. And then you're going to see the secondary market, which is those jobs that have always consistently been women. You're going to see your teachers. You're going to see your restaurant employees. You're going to see your people doing any kind of domestic labor work, childcare, all of those things, right? And then as you talk about globalization and new technologies are going to bring in less and less need for specific kinds of workers, because the technologies start to encompass those particular jobs. So when you talk about factory work and the way factories operate now compared to what they did in the industrial age, they're going to hire very different employees. They're going to have machines that do a lot of the things that people used to do, and that's to cut costs for the capitalist venture that is attempting to make money. There is a connectedness and a stratification within the global market. So when you talk about the market as a whole on a global frontier, you will see that there is everyone is connected. So no matter what, when you buy that shirt at Walmart or what have you, that shirt's made in several different locations globally with several different kinds of work based policies, with different safety regulations, with different wage regulations and what have you. So you're connected to the market no matter what you do. And even the jobs that you have here are connected to jobs in other places in the world. And those particular things are stratified in a way that the lower income countries and the lower the income individual is, the more likely they are to be in situations that are unsafe, economically unfavorable, chemically toxic, and that are incongruent with what that particular group of people or that community would have normally done for work. The World Bank and multinational corporations consistently provide and create systemic oppressions and stratification within our global economy. And I'm not going to get into all of that because, again, that could be another lecture. If you're really interested in this, take one of Dr. Palucci's classes. He will go on for days and it will be very enlightening and also feel very overwhelming that you cannot fix it all. There is an unequal wealth distribution. And again, I have linked some videos to that. Please, if nothing else, just watch a couple of them, click on them. They're fairly short and they're pretty good at explaining how our market works and why it's important. So the progress women have made in the workforce is this educational attainment. At this point, women make up the majority of, not by a significant amount. So say like 56-44, I made that number up. Do not quote me on that number, but it's something to that effect of educational degrees acquired. Women do outpace men at this juncture. We have made progress in what we earn. We just are not necessarily at the same rate in which men are. We have made some grounds in occupational diversity and our presence in leadership. Now, the concerns here is that there's still a lot of occupational segregation. And so getting into things like the trades, getting into jobs that require, getting into jobs that require you to be maybe a doctor or a lawyer, those things are still have barriers to them. There's barriers to promotions, to you generally have lower or unequal pay to the males that you work with. There's inadequate work flexibility, higher rates of poverty amongst women, lots of sexual harassment, lacks of access to affordable childcare that would allow you to be at work, and less benefits because of the link to part-time employment due to a lack of childcare. You have things that are considered pink collar jobs. And again, that's that occupational segregation thing happening again, where pink collar jobs are those jobs like teachers and things that we've talked about a lot as I've run through this. Jobs that are consistently talked about as women's work. So nurses, teachers, those kinds of things. You have blue collar jobs And if you notice the color differential, we're again gendering things in a very specific way with the intention of having a stratification there. You have your blue collar work, that's generally your trades, and your white collar work, and that is generally your finance division, anything where you're wearing a three-piece suit to work. And again, that white collar is indicative of not necessarily women in those spaces. And so those spaces generally do not occupy or do not have a demographically proportional ratio of women, of people of color, of any other of your marginalized identity statuses. Race and gender, again, intersect to increase pay, increase gaps in pay and opportunity. And then you have concepts like the glass ceiling, the glass escalator, and the glass precipice. Jesus, sorry. The glass ceiling is this idea that women can only get so far before they bump up against this ceiling that doesn't allow for promotions and things of that nature. Your glass escalator is this idea that in women-specific environments, like say nursing or say teaching, you're going to see this escalator escalate specific kinds of women or men within those fields. So you're going to see the men get escalated up to principal if they become teachers, as opposed to the women who may have more experience or what have you. And this glass precipice is this idea that there's a racial component as well that disallows specific kinds of marginalized groups to fulfill a role because that doesn't fit the standard operating idea of what that social norm is for that job. When we talk about wages, again, I've got some good graphics up here, but again, corporate leaders versus their corporate workers. On average, a CEO is paid 320 times as much as the typical worker in the industry. Again, I will say that this is not the lowest paid person in their job. This is the typical paid. So this is your middle ground. And they make 320 times, and you cannot tell me that they work 320 times more than that average employee. There's a significant wage gap between women and men, and this is kind of laid out, but it also, there's a race component to that too. And I have a down here in the corner, it talks about that for specifically women, but you could also put men of color on there, and they would also have a gap to white men. So just be mindful that when we talk about the gender gap, we need to also talk about how race impacts that gender gap, because women as a whole are not 80 cents on the dollar, because women as a whole are not all white. Women now earn the majority of college degrees, which we talked about a minute ago. And that it is moving, the gender gap is moving and trending in the right direction, but it moves about 0.5 cent a year, which at this rate, we will be the same as men long after I am gone. So the goal here is to make those equal pay policies and those things to hold that accountability to more drastically decrease that wage gap. And then we talk about this as a discriminatory practice because there is significant evidence that they will offer less to women, that employers will significantly decrease or are less likely to give women the higher leadership roles. And so there is a significant amount of discrimination that is a part of having the conversations about wages. And so I'm going to get off here, and then I'm going to do one more about the work articles that we talked about, and then we will be good to go for this module. I hope you all are doing great. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.